Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here, and I'm honored. I'm really excited to talk here in my home city. I work now in Scotland, but I maintain strong links with my Bulgarian colleagues, both in the civil society and in academia. And I see this as an opportunity to strengthen this links. We could think of joint projects and so on. It's a great opportunity, and we should really use it. So thank you very much for inviting me. I hope that my talk will generate some ideas for discussion, and also it could be a bit difficult to listen to, because I won't be talking about positive things. I'll be talking mainly about negative things. I think that we live currently in a very negative world, and hence, I think that we need to address these negativities head on. And particularly when disabled people are concerned and when disablement is concerned, the world has gone back. What happens in the post-socialist region is particularly revealing, and I'll be talking about disability and social change from the perspective of post-socialist disablement, because I think that the post-socialist situation may shed light on some issues that are happening also elsewhere, but here we see them, we feel them particularly strongly. Now, in order for you to know where I'm coming from, I will start with a personal reflection, something that will also provide you some ideas about my positionality. I think that it's very important to consider positionality, although positionality is sometimes regarded tokenistically, but nevertheless, for people who are engaged in qualitative social science, positionality is key. So, can I have my next slide, please? Next to the table, okay. Thank you. All right. So, in 1997, 1998, for 12 months, I worked part-time as ward attendant in a closed psychiatric hospital in Bulgaria. The psychiatry that you see on the slide is a Bulgarian psychiatry, but it's not the psychiatry that I worked in. I'm using this photograph for illustrative purposes. It nevertheless conveys some of the messages that I would like to make. I did night shifts, 7 or 8 per month, which enabled me to work while studying full-time. I was pursuing a degree in psychology, which I completed in 2000. While working in the psychiatry, I witnessed firsthand, and I was a reluctant participant in the reproduction of professional power and the institutional violence emanating from professional power. Let me provide a few illustrative examples. I witnessed the practice of locking people up in an isolation room that included a bed attached to the floor and a camera to observe the patient through a monitor in the staff room. On several occasions, I was called upon to help with holding patients so that they could be forcibly medicated. Having keys for the locked doors was a material token of power. A colleague told me on my first night shift that the person who has the keys is the person who is in control. I felt uncomfortable with this manifestations of professional power and institutional violence. I was just encountering the ideas of anti-psychiatry, and I was part of a group of like-minded students who are studying the psychotherapeutic approach of brief solution-focused therapy. On the slide, you see the covers of Tomáš Sas' book Ideology and Insanity and Steve DeShazer's book Words Were Originally Magic. What a wonderful title for a book. Solution-focused brief therapy challenges professional power by treating people who seek help with mental health issues as equal partners in constructing the solutions to their problems. As explained by Steve DeShazer also in this wonderful book, who is one of the founders of this approach to psychotherapy. And it was the opposite of what I witnessed in the psychiatric hospital. I resisted institutional culture and practices by conversing with the patients and by striving to take their words at face value rather than as symptoms. I avoided wearing a medical gown, but ironically it was the patients rather than the psychiatrists or the nurses who insisted that I did wear a gown. I guess to be more easily identifiable as belonging to the other side of the institutional divide. It's important to provide some context to this story. In Bulgaria, the second half of the 1990s was a time of scarcity, austerity, sometimes sheer chaos, and social abandonment. As elsewhere in the post-socialist region, psychiatric and other institutions were badly hit by the neoliberal restructuring and retrenchment that characterized this period. Ironically, from the perspective of the struggling psychiatry, these reforms were branded as shock therapy. For example, we did not have enough personal protective equipment, so sometimes I had to clean the corridors and the toilets without gloves. I used an old rack and a bucket. Sometimes there was no cleaning liquid, so I used plain water to clean the premises. Now and then I had to recycle the plastic bags that we used to collect rubbish by emptying them in the container outside and bringing them in to be reused. For a brief period, the dinner was so scarce that the patients must have gone to bed hungry. A slice of bread, a piece of cheese, and that's it. On the slide, you see a photograph that I've taken somewhere in Sofia, two abandoned Soviet-era cars. Post-socialist austerity exacerbated the violence of institutionalization by worsening the working conditions of the staff in institutions and the living conditions of institutional residents. However, it was the cultures and practices of institutionalization inherited from state socialist social policy to a great extent that created this violence in the first place, and that still maintain this violence as testified by the reports of the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture after its ad hoc visits to Bulgaria, including a visit in 2020 to examine psychiatric and social care institutions. And there is a quotation from this report on the slide. I'll read it. Patients were nearly exclusively restrained to beds with metal chains to wrists and ankles secured with padlocks, often for days on end. And the other quotation is from a seminal case at the European Court of Human Rights, Stanev versus Bulgaria. This happened earlier. I'll read it as well. The buildings did not have running water. The residents washed in cold water in the yard and were often unshaven and dirty. The bathroom, to which they had access once a week, was rudimentary and dilapidated. The toilets, likewise located in the yard, consisted of decrepit shelters with holes dug in the ground. They were in an execrable state and access to them was dangerous. Furthermore, basic toiletries were rarely available. And there is more of this horror in the report. My engagement with solution-focused brief therapy and anti-psychiatry, as well as my experience of working in the psychiatric hospital that I referred to, helped me understand the systemic character of institutional violence and prepared me for my subsequent involvement with the independent living movement. In 2000, I started working for the Center for Independent Living in Sofia, a Bulgarian disability rights organization founded and led by the disabled activist Kapka Panayotou. And on the slide you see a photo of Kapka. It's from an advocacy initiative in front of the Bulgarian parliament. That's where Kapka was really at her best. Ever since, I have been an ally of the independent living movement, although I have not yet identified as disabled. I owe much of my understanding of disability and social change to Kapka, and I would like to pay a tribute to her here as well. The ideas that I will now discuss are grounded in these post-socialist experiences that I referred to and in my encounters with disability activism and with Kapka Panayotova. These ideas have resulted in a series of publications. I have provided some of the references on the slide, and a monograph published by Routledge some years ago titled Disability and Post-Socialism. Here I will use Bulgarian examples, but I have looked at other post-socialist countries as well in my research, and most of the points that I make would be valid for the region as a whole. The ideas that I have in mind have revolved around the framework for critical and historically informed analysis of disablement in the post-socialist region. This framework has been theoretically informed by disability studies, by Nancy Fraser's theory of social justice, and by critical studies of post-socialism. And I will first say a few words about each of these background theoretical influences, and I will then present my framework and discuss the resulting analysis of disablement under post-socialism. So I start with disability studies, which is an interdisciplinary field of social scientific inquiry, which conceptualizes disability from a social constructionist perspective as something imposed on people by society. This approach has most famously been associated with the social model of disability, although other ideas have also been influential, including the independent living paradigm, as well as post-structuralist and post-Marxist concepts of the kind espoused by critical disability studies. And on the slide, I have provided some of the ideas, approaches, ideologies that have informed disability studies over the decades since it emerged in the 1980s and 1990s. Marxism, liberalism, consumerism, mutual help movement, cooperativism, post-structuralism, post-Marxism, decolonial studies, feminism, and crypt theory more recently. In a nutshell, the social constructionist perspective on disability illuminates injustices of disablement experienced by people with impairments due to certain structures, processes, and discourses. And these injustices can be economic, cultural, and political in character, and hence the next framework, Nancy Fraser's theory of social justice, the distinction between economic redistribution, cultural recognition, and political representation has been most famously developed in the work of the critical theorist Nancy Fraser, an American critical theorist and very influential feminist as well, in her theory of social justice. Very briefly, for Fraser, social justice means parity of participation or equality of participation in social life, and parity of participation requires economic redistribution, either surface level reallocation of economic outputs or deep level restructuring of the way economy functions, such as worker control, workplace democracy, and so on. Social justice also requires cultural recognition, including valorizing difference or emphasizing commonality. We are person first, we are all people. Or indeed deconstructing difference, deconstructing binary distinctions of a type done by post-structuralist analysis. And social justice also requires political representation, both at the ordinary level, ordinary political participation in decision making, as in voting, as in civil society activism, but also metapolitical decision making of the type that concerns who participates, who is enabled to participate in decision making and how. And thirdly, the post-socialist context and the study of post-socialism, critical study of post-socialism. The post-socialist experience sheds a very strong light, and in a certain sense a unique light, on disablement. I argue that the specificity of disablement in the post-socialist region of Central and Eastern Europe consists in its rootedness in the intersection between the state socialist order and the post-socialist neoliberal order in the three dimensions of economic redistribution, cultural recognition, and political participation. Simply put, we in present-day Central and Eastern Europe have had the worst of both worlds. The world of socialism and the world of capitalism. Our socialism was much more undemocratic, hierarchical, and top-down than Western European social democracy, for example. And our capitalism was much more neoliberal, much more radical in terms of marketization than Western European capitalism, even in its Thatcherist English version. In addition, our neoliberal capitalism made links with our state socialist legacies, producing intersecting harms. These harms may not be unique when taken in isolation, but when taken together, they outline a kind of a unique profile or physiognomy of the post-socialist situation in Central and Eastern Europe. And to put all this together, I have created this tool, and I called it a bit cheekily Post-Socialist Disability Matrix. It combines disability studies, social constructionist conceptualization of disability with Nancy Fraser's three-dimensional theory of justice and critical studies of post-socialism. This matrix illuminates the intersecting impact on disabled people in Central and Eastern Europe of state socialist legacies and post-socialist neoliberalization in each of Fraser's three dimensions of social justice. So this matrix captures disablement in the context of social change, basically. In brief, the disability policy legacy of state socialism has included segregated service provision, a medical productivist framing of disability, and weakened disability organizing, among other issues. On their behalf, post-socialist reforms have resulted in retrenchment of public support, overvaluation of self-sufficiency, and depoliticization of disability organizing, again, amongst other issues. We thus have intersecting instances of disablement in all three dimensions of social justice identified by Fraser: the economic, the cultural, and the political. And on the slide, you see a summary of this in a table form. Let me start with the dimension of economic redistribution, and I will first consider state socialist segregated provision and post-socialist welfare state retrenchment as intersecting and mutually reinforcing instances of post-socialist disablement. State socialist countries invested significant public funds into residential institutions for social care, such as asylums, closed psychiatric hospitals, care homes, and so on. And these institutions mushroomed throughout the Central and Eastern European region during the state socialist period. After the fall of state socialism in 1989-1991, the rise of poverty and the welfare state retrenchment that started in the 1990s increased the number of children and adults in these settings, while the living conditions there drastically deteriorated, as also reported in many international reports of the time, including reports drafted by the World Bank. Welfare state retrenchment also meant inadequate investment in community-based services, precisely at a time when the demand for such services was increasing. Services such as personal assistance, for example, or accessible and affordable housing in the community. We here in Bulgaria have a huge issue with social housing. Social housing policy is virtually non-existent. Against this background, the so-called deinstitutionalization reforms supported by the European Union through its structural and investment funds since the beginning of the 2000s have largely amounted to renovating existing institutions or to building new smaller institutions, such as small group homes, under the title of deinstitutionalization. In brief, post-socialist deinstitutionalization amounted to reinstitutionalization. The entrenched practices of channeling public funds towards segregated provision inherited from state socialist disability policy have persisted during the post-socialist period and have been compounded by newer processes of neoliberal welfare state retrenchment, where benefit cuts and failure to provide community-based support have increased the demand for institutional care as well as informal support. And it's important to note here that the increased demand for informal support has been part of the post-socialist retraditionalization of society, in which the family and within the family, mothers and grandmothers, women, have assumed increasing responsibility for the care of children, disabled people, and older people. Such processes of retraditionalization under neoliberalism have been studied in the feminist literature as instances of neoliberal neopatriarchy. Indeed, we are witnessing the resurgence of patriarchy in the post-socialist region. Not only, but in the post-socialist region, it's particularly strong. On the slide, you see, again, a quotation from Stanev versus Bulgaria case. I already read this, and also a recent report on small group homes in Bulgaria, very critical report drafted by Disability Rights International, called A Dead End for Children. In the dimension of cultural recognition, the intersecting instances of post-socialist disablement I have considered in my work are state socialist medical productivist conception of disability and post-socialist overvaluation of self-sufficiency. It's interesting how these two instances of misrecognition have intersected as well. Following the Soviet blueprint, state socialist countries in Central and Eastern Europe adopted centralized systems for disability assessment based on a medical productivist approach in which a medical diagnosis is associated with a degree of decreased ability or decreased capacity to work. This approach reduced disabled people to deficient body minds and inefficient resources, and enhance the misrecognition of disabled people in all areas of life, from the family to the school to the factory. Long after the fall of the state socialist regime in many, perhaps most post-socialist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the management and understanding of disability has continued to be dominated by medical professionals and medical productivist categories. As the labor medical expert commissions in Bulgaria testify, indeed, it has been notoriously difficult to dislodge this system and to substitute this system with something else in Bulgaria, but elsewhere as well. This framing of disability has been compounded by the neoliberal overvaluation of self-sufficiency and the attendant stigmatization of public assistance underpinned by the discourse of welfare dependency, a very new conservative way of stigmatizing people who receive social support. When citizenship requires self-sufficiency, the people framed as functionally deficient and economically inefficient, or as deficient body minds and inefficient resources, are bound to be perceived as second-class citizens. And here you see the intersection between medical productivist invalidation and the discourse of self-sufficiency. Of note here is that the overvaluation of self-sufficiency did not increase the independence of disabled people in the post-socialist region. And this is because independent living is not about self-sufficiency, but about support that maximizes choice and control in people's lives, including control over the support people receive to cope and to be able to live dignified lives. Therefore, considering independent living in terms of self-sufficiency amounts to misusing the term, and is sometimes actually used to legitimize retrenchment of public support, something that the independent living movement has criticized but has nevertheless continued, including in the post-socialist region. So, independent living and the ideas of the independent living movement are undermined or diminished by a lack of support, by support provided in segregated settings, and also by support provided or available only informally within the family. The third point suggests that the post-socialist revival of the patriarchal family has diminished opportunities for independent living in concert with post-socialist overvaluation of self-sufficiency, retrenchment of public support, and continuing provision of segregated support. So you see here how all these mechanisms of disablement intersect and interrelate, which partly explains why it has been so difficult to overcome the mechanisms illuminated by the post-socialist disability matrix. On the slide, you see a sign of the Territorial Expert Medical Commission in Bulgaria, and also an example of the overvaluation of self-sufficiency, the justification of the Bulgarian law on state budget of 2016, which states that freezing benefits would decrease dependency on state assistance. A quotation from a report by Vanya Grigorov, actually. And finally, the dimension of political representation. I hope you're still with me. In this dimension, post-socialist disablement has consisted in systematic weakening of the capacities for self-organizing of disabled people, not only of disabled people, but of disabled people as well. The well-known suppression of disability organizing during state socialism was a function of the more general suppression of the political public sphere, where civil society entities such as charities, associations, self-help groups, and even trade unions were either disbanded or reconstituted as extensions of the state without any opportunity to have or to be independent. The weaknesses of disability organizing inherited from state socialism were partly and indeed temporarily offset by the general increase of activism in the aftermath of 1989. A wave of descending critical and countercultural initiatives emerged in the 1990s and the first half of the 2000s. And the Center for Independent Living in Sofia was part of this resurgence of civil society in Bulgaria. However, subsequent chronic underfunding and underfunding particularly of advocacy, and since the middle of the 2000s, ironically since Bulgaria, in the Bulgarian case, since we joined the European Union, has nudged many of these post-socialist disability organizations towards service provision, thus depoliticizing civil society initiatives. Not only disability organizations, women organizations were also nudged towards service provision and away from advocacy. This process has been underpinned by the neoliberal model of civil society development, identified by the human geographer David Harvey as privatization by NGO. In this model, civil society is framed as privately funded or privately supported, privately maintained provider of services that fills the gap in social support opened by welfare state retrenchment. In addition, post-socialism has been characterized by institutionalizing participation in disability policy making through national consultative bodies such as disability councils, following the model of tripartism, which is a kind of a contemporary neo-corporatism where representatives of the main stakeholders in society, such as the state, business, and labor, get together to negotiate economic policy. Tripartism in disability policy making has encouraged consensus-oriented initiatives and has actually marginalized conflict-oriented ones. The members of the consultative bodies, the biggest disability organizations, some of them with deep roots in the state socialist past, have been reluctant to engage in campaigning and critique unless this campaigning has meant maintaining their privileged position on the table, which they have been careful to preserve, and in some cases this privileged position has included government subsidies. Imagine how you criticize the government when you receive a government subsidy. I mean, it's impossible. On the slide, you see two photographs. The first is from an advocacy action, direct action by CAL Sofia in support for personal assistance, and the other photograph is from the Council of Ministers building in Sofia, which hosts the National Council on People with Disabilities. So let's summarize all this. The analytical framework that I presented, the post-socialist disability matrix, enables a comprehensive, systematic and historically grounded, historically informed analysis of disablement in the post-socialist region of Central and Eastern Europe. Taken in isolation, the different elements of post-socialist disablement, such as, for example, institutionalization of disabled people, or medicalization of disability, or retrenchment of public support, may not be unique to the post-socialist region, and they actually are not unique to the post-socialist region. But when put together, and in the context of a transition from state socialism to neoliberal capitalism, they outline a specific profile of disablement. This specificity could underpin a specifically post-socialist reflection on disablement, which I tried to convey to you today. For me, the main features of this perspective is double-edged skepticism towards both the market and the state, because the post-socialist region has witnessed the worst of both. This double-edged skepticism has often fed distrust in institutions and society, and support for populist politicians and governments. This distrust in institutions has fed support for right-wing populism, actually. But I believe that this double-edged skepticism could also enable critical analysis and progressive action. I think that it's important not to abandon skepticism, but to reclaim skepticism for critical analysis, or to insist that skepticism is important for critical analysis and progressive action. And I would like to finish by actually opening this framework with some reflections on what's currently happening in the region, and perhaps this could also serve to encourage debate and discussion. This is something that we have recently developed with Ina Dimitrova, who's here today with us from Plovdiv University, in a paper published in Critical Sociology. There we argue that the understanding of disablement in present-day Central and Eastern Europe needs to consider more recent trends in the region as well, such as rising illiberalism and deepening social abandonment, particularly as far as marginalized groups in society are concerned. The guiding opposition of the disability rights movement in the global north has been between professional power and user empowerment. But these new trends raise questions such as how to criticize professional power amidst social abandonment, and how to assert user empowerment when it's framed as Western propaganda and worse, as an elitist, out-of-touch fantasy. I don't have answer to these questions, and in our paper, I don't think that we provide definitive answers. It's happening now. It's difficult to know what's exactly what will come out of it. But I think that the very act of asking questions like this, in addition to the questions that are emerging from analysis such as the one that the post-socialist disability matrix encourages. So asking questions like this makes actually possible social change. And this is another lesson that I have learned from the disabled activist Kapka Panayotova. Although I must admit that she would have never stopped with asking questions. She would have organized people to defend their rights and their dignity and their freedom. So that's how I would like to finish, and thank you for your attention.